Thank you for attending In Their Names, the untold story of victims' rights, mass incarceration, and the future of public safety, hosted by the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center at The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. Before we begin, we have just a few notes we'd like to share with you. First, to streamline the appearance of the webinar, we suggest that you hide non-video participants. Second, we want to draw your attention to the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. The chat is disabled, but you may submit questions via the Q&A at any time. Please note that there is limited time available at the end of the webinar for Q&A. Third, closed captioning has been enabled for this event. To change how you view the transcription or to hide it, click Show Captions in the menu at the bottom of your Zoom window. Finally, this event is being recorded. The recording will be made available on the event page and social media channels as soon as possible after the event. Follow us at OSU Law, DEPC to stay up to date on our research, programming, and future events. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the event. Doug?
Thank you so much, Holly, and thank you to everybody at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center for helping to provide this opportunity for us to talk with three. We're very fortunate to have three members of the Alliance for Safety and Justice with us to mostly focus on the great new book by Lenore Anderson, who is going to talk about, I'll give the full title, In Their Names, the Untold Story of Victims' Rights, Mass Incarceration, and the Future of Public Safety. I think that everybody's thinking about the future of public safety these days, and so really excited to have these folks with us who've worked on these issues in so many different and important ways, both here in Ohio and throughout the country, and to talk about their work. Just to introduce myself first, I'm Doug Berman. I'm a professor here at the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law, and also help to direct the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center that's helping to host this conversation about this important book and all the issues that it touches upon. Of course, we're not going to get to talk about all the issues in just the 75 minutes we have together. That's why you have to go buy the book and continue thinking about these matters. But fortunately, we have three terrific folks to provide insights, including the author. I'm going to introduce them each quickly. Got to put on my glasses so I can be sure to read all the particulars and get them right. And then I'll have some questions. Hopefully, we can turn this into a conversation rather than sort of a full Q&A. Speaking of the Q&A, though, I wanted to reinforce what Holly mentioned. I see a couple folks have already introduced themselves through the Q&A feature. Folks should feel free just to say hello to others who are there and see the questions. Though I'm not sure everybody can see them. I can see the questions, and I'll be in a position to hopefully bring some of those into our conversation by the end of the hour. So with those basic ground rules, here's some short bios for folks who I'd take up the entire time if I read their full bios, but here we go. First, our author and sort of featured guest, you might say, Lenore Anderson is the founder and president of the Alliance for Safety and Justice, which has won reforms to reduce incarceration and expand community safety programs across the country. She's a former chief of policy at the San Francisco District Attorney's Office, former director of public safety for the Oakland mayor, and the recipient of the James Irvine Foundation Leadership Award and the American Bar Association's Frank Carrington Crime Victim Attorney Award. She's also a 2020 Social Entrepreneurs in Residence Fellow at Stanford University. In Their Names is her first book, and she lives with her family in Oakland, California. Hello, Lenore. Thanks for joining us. So glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Also with us is Shakyra Diaz. Shakyra is a strategist with extensive public policy and organizing experience grounded in authentic coalition building. Shakyra is the Alliance for Safety and Justice's Chief of Federal Advocacy. In this capacity, she advocates to expand federal resources that enhance best practice safety solutions to stop the cycle of violence, to support underserved victims of crime, and to remove barriers for people with past convictions. She previously served as the Chief of Staff, Ohio State Director, and Managing Director of Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. Shakyra joined ASJ in 2016, where she provided leadership for advocacy campaigns in the Midwest, resulting in criminal justice reforms and the establishment of trauma recovery centers to help underserved crime victims heal. Shakyra is a graduate of Case Western Reserve University and lives in Cleveland, Ohio with her family. Thanks for joining us, Shakyra. I really appreciate you being here and helping us to put this together.
Glad to be
Last, but absolutely not least, our very special guest, Aswad Thomas, who's the current vice president of the Alliance for Safety and Justice, national director of ASJ's flagship project, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, and the author of his own book, The Stars Represent You and Me. Aswad is a surviving victim of violence. I think we're going to talk about that, and well aware of the impact of trauma and loss that many in communities across the country have experienced and continue to live with. In 2009, Aswad became the first male in his family to graduate from college. The sad part of that story, he was just 3 weeks away from going to Europe to play professional basketball when he became a victim of gun violence. 2 near-fatal gunshots to your back not only ended your basketball career, but nearly ended your life. I know you're going to talk about that a little bit, and that you were driven by this traumatic experience and your passion for helping others to deal with their own trauma, that you've dedicated your life to organizing communities and helping to elevate the voices of victims and their families. Through both state and federal policymaking debates, you've become one of the country's leading policy experts on gun violence, criminal justice reform, and in building coalitions across racial lines to advance safety. We're so grateful to have you here and the role that you take on with ASJ's national network of crime survivors to include those most commonly affected by violence, most notably young men of color. Thank you for joining us as well. Could not think of a stronger group of 3 individuals, the work that you've been doing to talk through. Again, I'll give the title of the book and one more plug for it, Lenore, as we turn to some direct questions and get you all to speak about this. The name of the book is In Their Names, The Untold Story of Victims' Rights, Mass Incarceration, and the Future of Public Safety. And I could probably do an hour just on the title, but I want to hear first and foremost sort of what inspired you to write this book, and maybe provide a little bit of the themes and backstory that both led to the book's production and what was so important for you to emphasize through your work here.
Thank you so much. So you heard a little bit about Alliance for Safety and Justice in the introductions. I'm an attorney and an advocate. We advocate for reforms to public safety and criminal justice policy in state houses across the country. We've been doing this work for about a decade. I have been working on criminal justice reform for about 25 years. And, one of the things that we run into rather frequently, our main sort of policy emphasis is what we call smart crime policy. So a reduced emphasis on incarceration and increase in crime prevention. That matches with what the majority of people in the country think we should be prioritizing: less incarceration, more prevention. But when you're in state houses talking to legislators, those reforms are actually very difficult to achieve. And one of the main reasons they're so difficult to achieve in state houses is because of this pervasive myth. That pervasive myth is that tough justice is for the purpose of protecting victims and improving safety. The impact of this myth is this idea that you can't be for safety and for reform at the same time. Well, what we know, working with survivors of harm across the country, working with people who have old records across the country, what we know is that myth is really setting up a situation like a false dichotomy, right? Where it's preventing real reform from happening. And so I wanted to write this book in large part to kind of break through that. I wanted to lift up and expose the ways in which victims of crime specifically have been harmed by mass incarceration. I also wanted to spend time lifting up the solutions that we know would work much better. When you're turning on the TV these days, there's an awful lot of discussion around crime policy. We're hearing some of the sort of old rhetoric that we used to hear quite a bit in the 80s and 90s in terms of law and order and tough on crime. So this story of how all of that tough justice actually hurt the people in whose names it was built, that's a story that needs to be told right now. You're muted. Doug, unmute. Yeah, there
Not
you go.
unmute. There we go. You think I'd learned this by now, but in any event, I was so excited to jump in and didn't click the button to allow me to follow up with you, Lenore. You mentioned it a little bit, but I guess I'd like you to unpack a little bit more. I know you do it in the book at some length, this kind of historical sense that, again, I think we're seeing some more of today, that there's this dichotomy between, the tough on crime crowd and the soft on crime crowd. Certainly there's an effort to say, no, we want to be smart, and break out of that dichotomy more generally, but that the tough on crime crowd, they're the ones who really care about victims, and they're the ones carrying sort of the policy for victims' interests, and the soft on crime crowd, they don't care about victims, or if they do, they're just not as attentive to victims' concerns. And I think you're not only seeking to break through that narrative, but explain to some degree kind of how that narrative developed and how it can be so pernicious in actually serving the interests of victims. And I'd love you to sort of talk a little bit more about both, how historically we got to this point where that tough on crime rhetoric was at least perceived to be sort of in service to victims, or at least could be leveraged that way. And, some of the themes and that you're emphasizing to break away from that, especially because, as you mentioned, with concerns about increasing violent crime in the wake of, some pandemic realities and others, it seems like we're getting back to that, 80s and 90s mindset of, tough and tougher. And of course, I'm tough and tougher because I care about the victims, and anybody who's not preaching that theme must not care about the victims or not care about them sufficiently relative to under interest. And so love to get a little bit of that history, a little bit of what do you think are the themes for breaking through that now?
So in the 1970s, that's the time period where many people, excuse me, identify the origin of the victims' rights movement in the United States. It emerged, the victims' rights movement in the United States emerged from sort of a divergent set of precursors. Their feminist movement concerns lifted up about victims of sexual assault and victims of domestic violence being ignored. Many people who had experienced repeated crime, lifting up the failure of local law enforcement and criminal justice system to adequately address repeat cycles of violence. There were concerns that are legitimate. We have not ever had a criminal justice system that was designed at its foundation to really meet the needs of most victims of crime. And just in the legal sense, right? We have an adversarial criminal justice system where it's essentially the state versus the person being accused of a crime. And in that contest between the state and the representatives of the defendant, victims are legally witnesses at best. And that's essentially all. So victim disregard and even re-traumatization through that process is something that had been going on for a long time. So those legitimate concerns were lifted up in the 70s and the 80s. But what happened in response was the challenge. The response to the concern of victim disregard by the criminal justice system was to beef up the criminal justice system. There was a sort of a usurping of that message of forgotten victims, and politicians of all stripes, whether, didn't matter political persuasion, politicians started sort of kind of stepping over each other to appear tougher and tougher on crime for the purposes of supporting those forgotten victims. There were a couple of things that emerged from that. We saw victims' rights amendments passed across the country. These are typically constitutional amendments that give victims rights to speak in criminal court, rights to access things like restitution, compensation. That's what happened on paper in terms of the literal shift in legal rights that victims have. But at the same time, politically, those calls were combined with a call for fewer opportunities for release for people who are incarcerated, fewer what was referred to as amenities for people in prison, where we're actually going to toughen that prison environment. And longer and longer sentences, sort of the ratcheting up of the mandatory enhancements of all stripes. Well, those increases in power led to a shift in money and political influence for a whole bunch of criminal justice bureaucracies. But giving those very bureaucracies who have never really been very good at meeting victims' needs more power and really miss the mark in terms of the actual real world impact on victims. And I'll just summarize a couple of the real world impacts. One is that at the foundational level in American criminal justice, there is a hierarchy of harm. There is a hierarchy of whose pain has mattered, whose victimization has really mattered to the criminal justice system and whose has not. This has been expressed along race and socioeconomic lines. This shows up in terms of which cases make the nightly news, to which prosecutions or investigations are taken most seriously, all the way over to which victims are trusted on the witness stand or given access to compensation. So there's this discrimination that is happening across the spectrum in terms of victims. The empowerment of the criminal justice system never addressed that. That hierarchy of harm, in fact, became more extreme as we built up the power of the criminal justice system. The second thing is that is really important to understand is because that justice system growth essentially meant mass incarceration and mass surveillance, primarily in communities of color, you actually lessened the trust of everyday folks with the justice system, which has the impact of reducing the likelihood that people will report crime, reducing the likelihood that people support what the criminal justice system's gonna do in response. So you've got expanded discrimination, you've got less trust, and finally, Doug, a ton of money going to a system that means we're not actually investing in capacitating communities for prevention.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to return to this concept of hierarchy of harm with some of our other guests in a minute, but I got one kind of last one for you because I think you touched on it a little bit, but I want to unpack it a little bit more if possible, in part because the subtitle of your book is The Untold Story of Victims' Rights, Mass Incarceration, and the Future of Public Safety, right? That's there are a number of books that have been written and folks who concern themselves with victims' rights and the way victims are served or disserved by our criminal justice system, but tying that to mass incarceration. And you mentioned what I think is one piece of it, which is kind of the allocation of resources and energy and time toward punishment, surveillance, a criminal justice apparatus that's about law enforcement rather than serving victims' needs. But I think there are other aspects about incarceration and the way in which incarceration contributes to victimization and trauma that are, important themes in your book. And I wonder if you want to sort of talk quickly about the way in which incarceration, among other aspects of our criminal justice system, is not just maybe a misallocation, but a contributor to victimization and trauma in ways that are an important part of the story.
Yeah, it's really critical for people who may not be as familiar with how our justice system works to understand just how much it is a part of the cycle of trauma. At this point, experts, people who've been working on violence prevention and community safety understand quite a bit about the causes of the cycle of crime and violence. We have a saying, those of us who've worked in criminal justice and public safety, we say, hurt people, right? And what that means is we well know that if we don't provide people with basic access to crisis assistance and safety, and when people get hurt, don't help them recover, that is going to be a contributor to a cycle of harm. And that hurt people bears out when you look at the statistics. When you look at who's going into our criminal justice system, 90% of the people who enter our prisons and jails have histories of trauma, histories of victimization. And one of the questions, that we ask is, long before anyone committed a crime, what was done in response to their experiences of victimization? If nothing was done, we have to understand that we're kind of contributing to that cycle. Well, there's another saying, and that other saying that we have is healed people. So at the same time that we know that hurt people, we can interrupt the cycle of trauma and do something different. It's just not what our criminal justice system is very good at doing. Look just specifically at the conditions inside prisons and jails. These are toxic conditions. These are conditions literally designed from the ground up to cause trauma, right? To cause hyper stress, to cause a retriggering of PTSD, sleeplessness, depression, isolation. These are facilities that are designed to essentially cut people off from humanity. That is how we have, as sort of as a society, responded to the cycle of trauma, is to place people in facilities and in conditions that are traumatizing in themselves. So you can see how that just continues to contribute. Many people have eloquently described the struggles of trying to recover from the experience of incarceration. They're very similar to the struggles of trying to recover from any number of things that can cause severe trauma. We can interrupt it. Trauma recovery centers, rehabilitation, cognitive behavioral therapy. There are so many opportunities to do something different, to put people on a path to behavior change, but it's going to have to start with empathy and not toxic incarceration.
Thank you so much. And now I'm going to turn to you, Aswad, in part because, I was so glad that you could join us, because the book starts with your story, as I understand it. And it's such a powerful way to start the book, Lenore, and I just so drew me in, and is both incredibly sad, but incredibly uplifting to have you here and know about the work that you're doing now. So, if you're comfortable doing it, I'd appreciate it if you sort of talk about your experience with violence and as a victim, and the way in which the criminal justice system, interacted, and how that informed the work that you're continuing to do to try to build a better system.
Yeah, no, thanks, Doug. And it's always an honor, Lenore. Even though I work with you every day, talk to you multiple times a day, just to hear, just your expertise, your perspective on like how the justice system has failed victims. And Lenore, every time I hear you talk, for me, I'm just going back to all of my life experiences. And long before I became a victim of gun violence in 2009, I lost my best friend, Ruben Elder, to a drive-by shooting in 1993. And Ruben Elder is one of the many cases that are still unsolved today. And throughout my life, Ruben was the first friend that I lost to violence, but unfortunately, he wasn't the last. I've lost about 40 friends to gun violence throughout my life. And I come from a family of victims of gun violence. My father was shot in the 1980s. My brother was shot in the 1990s. I have two first cousins that were also shot, and myself as well is a victim of gun violence. And in those, in my family's experience, and even in my experience of after I got shot, I was released from the hospital back into that same neighborhood where I lived at. And I remember, during my recovery process of physically recovering from these two gunshot wounds, which my doctors told me that it was going to be a long journey, kind of walk me through where some of the physical challenge was going to be for me. But nobody talked to me about the psychological effects, the emotional effects of being a victim of violent crime. So nobody told me about the PTSD that I will be going through, about the flashbacks, the nightmare, the anxiety, the stress, the depression. Nobody prepared me for that part of being a victim of violence. And as I was recovering, I had many interactions with law enforcement who came to visit me often during my recovery process. And each time they visited me, they never asked me how I was doing. They never told me about the state's victims compensation program. In fact, they never even connected me to the victim advocate in their department who's supposed to work with crime victims like myself. And so my family and I was left to deal with that experience of me being a victim of gun violence on our own. And what really kind of like changed my life was, during my last doctor's appointment to remove the bullets out of my back, as I was getting surgery performed on me, my doctor started to, tell me the story about this other young man who he had treated 4 years prior from a gunshot wound as well. This young man was 14 years old. As a result of that shooting, he lost sight in his left eye. And like the more details my doctor was sharing about that young man, my heart just started to beat faster and faster, because I was realizing he was describing the young man that shot me. And I remember telling my doctor that I kind of say, can you hold on? Because I don't know if you realize, but you just described the person that shot me. And I remember my Dr. Marshall, told me, it was unbelievable. He couldn't imagine that someone who he had treated 4 years prior in that same hospital, got released back into that same community, just like myself, not connected to any victim services, any mental health support, any housing relocation support, and years later was involved in my shooting. And that's how the cycle of violence continues in communities. And that's what kind of like what led me on this journey today, working with crime survivors for safety and justice and talking to thousands of crime victims across the country. We were just in Ohio 2 weeks ago for our annual Survivor Speak event. We brought hundreds of crime victims to Columbus, to the state capitol for Advocacy Day to meet with legislators around some of these priorities, around trauma recovery centers and more services for victims, more rehabilitation. But I can tell y'all, in that moment in Columbus 2 weeks ago, there was a part where we're in the capitol, in the atrium, and you had these mothers who started to stand up and share their stories of losing. One mom shared she lost both her sons to gun violence. Those cases are unsolved, no help. Another mom shared, I lost my daughter to gun violence, no help. Another woman shared that I'm a victim of domestic violence, a victim of sexual assault, no help, right? So in that space, just 2 weeks ago, of crime victims across the state of Ohio and also across the country, people are suffering from the impacts of violence. And unfortunately, our justice system have failed crime victims, especially crime victims that look like me. Black men have been disregarded and disrespected for decades. We're not even seen as victims, but we are the ones that are most harmed by violence, but we are the least supported by the justice system. We are least supported by victim services as well. And so the work that we do today at Crime Survivors for Safety, just really lifting up the voice and experiences of those people who are most harmed and having them uplift the safety solutions. As Lenore mentioned, is things like ensuring people get access to the victims compensation program. Most crime victims do not know that compensation exists. If they know it exists, there are a lot of barriers to access that support. Most communities that are dealing with cycle of violence every day don't have an infrastructure of victim services in communities. This is why we need to really build and invest in things like trauma recovery centers to help people heal and recover from violence. So just imagine if there was a trauma recovery center back in my neighborhood, years ago when that young man was shot, maybe I would be finishing up my professional basketball career overseas, but unfortunately I became a victim. That young man didn't get any help, and that young man is now incarcerated as well. So the cycle of violence continues unless we really lift up some of the safe solution that Lenore talked about in his book and the work that ASJ is doing.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. And one thing that I want to sort of tease out a little bit more, Lenore spoke about it, you did as well, and maybe you want to say a little bit more in response to this kind of just sort of comment, but observation as well, is there's a lot of conversation, I think, in the criminal justice reform, especially sort of the professors and the like, are like, we really need to focus on clearance rates. And, it's really important, and you both emphasized how, obviously, if a crime's not solved, it's hard to serve the victim, and the victim has to deal with that continuing uncertainty that goes with just no addressing. And you mentioned this a couple of times. A part of that concern, certainly a part of what drives our center's concern about the way the war on drugs gets enforced, is when you have distrust in a community, that's going to undercut clearance rate. People are not going to be as willing to report crime, to work with police, because there's just not that sort of base of community trust that's so essential to doing the kind of crime investigation and solving that's essential. But I hadn't even thought about, and I sort of am drawing it from the comments already, that, and also if the community sees that victims are not being well served by enforcement, right? Why go report a crime if your sense is, even if I know who did it, the person who suffered isn't going to get any benefit from this crime being solved, either because it's not addressed, or I don't think I'll get anything more from the system simply because I explain what I know or think about who's involved. And so the way in which disserving victims' interests, community interests, ends up undercutting these clearance rate concerns, and as I'm sure you're all aware, but do it for the audience as well. One of the big themes here is, look, no matter how harsh the punishment is, no matter how many people you put in prison, if the average person thinks that they're not going to get caught, you don't get any deterrent effect. You don't get any real public safety from ratcheting up punishments if they're not consistently applied, and people don't think their crimes will be identified. And so these clearance rate issues become a focal point, but disserving victims just further presents challenge for doing better. And so against that backdrop, again, happy to have comments on that, but Shakyra, I want to get you in the mix, and particularly get you to maybe expand on this idea of hierarchy of harm. I think we heard the phrase used by Lenore. I think Aswad spoke to it to some degree, that there are certain kinds of victims, there are certain members of our community whose harm is not sort of regarded the same way by the criminal justice system. But my sense is there are a lot of elements to this. I'm already thinking of all the different ways in which I see hierarchies in the way our system responds to wrongdoing and trauma. And so I'd love to have you kind of expand on that, and especially kind of connect it with the policy work that you do and kind of what you've learned about just not only this different way that harm is treated, but the way in which those differences kind of map out to the way our criminal justice system functions.
Thank you, Doug, and really appreciate this conversation. I often tell Lenore that, her book helps thousands of people feel seen for the first time. So I personally really appreciate it. So this hierarchy of harm is really about attributing value, not just to individuals, but to entire communities, right? And determining whether or not those people are deserving of any support. In many ways, Aswad and I grew up very similarly. My first friend was shot and killed when my first exposure to gun violence was when a friend of mine was shot and killed when I was 14 years old. I have lost over 40 friends and loved ones to gun violence. But my personal experience in terms of interacting with the justice system started out at a particular moment in my life. I was the victim of stalking for a 5-year period. It started the junior year after the summer after my junior year. And it was a very long period of time. My senior year in college, I went out with a friend of mine who put something in a drink of mine and sexually assaulted me. I never reported that sexual assault because of how the system was interacting with me as somebody who was actively being stalked, even though I knew who sexually assaulted me. So we fast forward to me being somebody who was a former educator professionally. I graduated from college, become an educator, leave that field because I wanted to get a better understanding of policies that were impacting the lives of my students. I was fortunate enough to work at my old high school and just saw these insurmountable barriers and saw how the school that I graduated from had changed dramatically. I'd seen, metal detectors erected, soap in the bathroom removed, and my students having my French book that was 30 years old when I had it. So I wanted to understand where are the resources going? Why is it so hard for my students and their families to get ahead despite the fact that they're so committed? And my very first campaign in this space was centered around this problem that was persistent in Cleveland that everyone knew about and just accepted. It was just a common thing. This is how it goes down. And the issue was that people within the city limits, within the city of Cleveland, who were arrested with no drugs, but a crack pipe, which is technically a misdemeanor, paraphernalia possession, were going to prison with a felony conviction. And only people from Cleveland who were primarily African-American were going to prison in Ohio's prisons for this particular offense. Well, why is that? The reason was that the city of Cleveland was choosing to test crack pipes, the paraphernalia, for cocaine residue, and then charge folks under the state code, the Ohio Revised Code, for cocaine possession, which is a felony. So they were superseding, right? Just really ramping up the one felony convictions and who was going to prison. After a couple of years, we were able to work on the issue. Cleveland decided to change their policy. During that time, it's uncovered that there was, unfortunately and tragically, a man who was eventually arrested and sentenced to prison for kidnapping and killing 11 African-American women. And one of those women who became a leader within our network is was instrumental in changing policies in the state of Ohio. But it's important to name her story. She was able to get away, she escaped, she called the police and shared what she had seen in this home. And she was told that they couldn't come to her, that she needed to come to the police station. Several women were killed after that. This woman, who's seen some of the most horrific things that no one should see, is later arrested on a probation violation for drug possession. And while she's in jail, the man who kidnapped her, who had killed all these women, was also in jail. And she told the judge and anyone who would listen, I've been in that house. I know what that man did, which led to further investigation and uncovering that the city of Cleveland had not been testing rape kits for decades. And for me, that was such a profound moment, because I know that the city of Cleveland was investing a lot of time and a lot of resources in testing crack pipes for the specific purpose of overcharging and sending people to prison. The majority of our public safety resources, or a significant number of our public safety resources, are going to minor drug possession enforcement. Meanwhile, you have a situation where people who are being harmed are being ignored. The family members of these women attempted to report that their family members were missing, and they were completely ignored. In many cases, their reports weren't even taken. These families had to create their own flyers. So it's terribly heartbreaking to know where our public dollars are going and to know who's being ignored. So this woman who could not get any help as a crime victim, who is who's left on her own, like many crime victims, to figure out and numb themselves through this trauma, comes in contact with the justice system, not because they're trying to help her, but they're criminalizing her because of how she's dealing with the disregard and the survivor's guilt that she has, which she carried heavily. Back in this time period, the city of Cleveland said, okay, we're going to start testing rape kits. Eventually, so what ends up happening is, like, after uncovering all these untested rape kits, AG DeWine, who is now Governor DeWine, launches this initiative to support the testing of rape kits across the state of Ohio. And, you know, a few years ago, while I was working at ASJ, maybe about 2 years by then, I'm home with my daughter, she's sick, and someone comes to my door, pounding and kicking at my door. I didn't open the door. The person put a subpoena into my mail chute. I read it, and I was being asked to testify or appear in court for the man who had been stalking me several years prior. So I called the prosecutor's office and I said, you know, I know that your office is going to be reaching out to hundreds of sexual assault victims whose rape kit you had not tested. They were trying to re-engage folks, right? And I said, maybe you shouldn't send people to our homes who are going to pound and kick at our doors as if we are criminals. And the response that I got from the prosecutor's office was, well, we'll try to talk to them, but the people who are doing this are also serving warrants. So this is how they engage. Our membership in the Alliance for Safety and Justice is Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, Underserved Victims of Crime, and Time Done, which is our constituency of people with past convictions. The reason that we do the work the way that we do it is because our folks, our membership, which the majority of our staff identifies as one or the other, understands that unaddressed trauma will lead you to the justice system. It is the only way that systemically we are seen, because when we need support, we are completely ignored and disregarded. And however we try to cope with, deal with, heal is criminalized. So it creates this dichotomy where often when we're talking to policymakers initially, because we've been conditioned to believe that crime victims are this group and folks who are in contact with the justice system are in this group. Our folks understand that there's a bridge there, that there's an overlap there, because we have experienced that disregard. We know where the investments are going. We know that we are being targeted for arrest for the most minor things and completely disregarded systemically, whether it's through legislation, policy, investments, when we are victims of crime or when we need support the most.
Yeah, and I want to jump in and get, Lenore back in here as well, both because she writes eloquently about this hierarchy of harm idea through the book, but also, emphasizes the theme that you're emphasizing and that your organization, reflects in so many ways, that not only is it deeply misguided to look at crime victims and those who are investigated and subject to criminal justice involvement as, very different groups, but it's not just they're overlapping, they're often the very same communities, and then as communities are being harmed, it's even oftentimes hard to differentiate. And I think this is not understood by individuals who live in certain communities where, well, obviously the police are very different than the people, who are committing offenses, or, we just can have this vision of they're the people who keep me safe and they're the people who hurt me. But in fact, there's all sorts of, realities in which the communities that are suffering as crime victims are also, a focal point for criminal justice enforcement. And Lenore, I'd love to have you sort of talk more about that. You can say it a lot better than I could about how these communities overlap and how problematic it is that often there is, again, ironically, the same people going to the same neighborhoods, serving warrants and trying to identify victims. That itself can perpetuate harm, even when there's a nominal effort to incorporate victims' voices.
Yeah, there's this, we talk about the myths in the criminal justice system, and one of the myths that's really, pervasive is this myth that you have, people who commit crime and people who are victims, and never the twain shall meet. There's no overlap between these two sort of permanent populations. And then the job of the justice system then is very simple, which is to find the people who commit crimes and, incapacitate them for as long as possible. That is, that oversimplification might make for good sound bites, but it is actually very harmful from a public safety policy perspective. The reality is we're actually talking about concentric or, overlapping circles, the Venn diagram, right? We're talking about the life circumstances facing people who are hurt by crime and violence, especially people who are repeatedly hurt by crime and violence. The life circumstances that they often face are markedly similar to the life circumstances of people who end up perpetrating a crime. And understanding that we're actually talking about a Venn diagram where many people who are in the center of that have at one point been a victim of crime, and at the next point may have perpetrated a crime. That complexity, if we could have a justice system that was better at understanding that complexity, it would be better at stopping that cycle. Right. Again, when we're talking about a cycle of trauma, if we're empowering a justice system that is not very good at distinguishing between vulnerability and dangerousness, if we have a justice system that really can't make that distinction very effectively, then we're contributing to that cycle of trauma instead of interrupting it. So it's really important to understand these overlapping life circumstances. And it makes a big difference in terms of how you seek to resolve the issues. One of the things that we talk a lot about at our organization is the need to just engage with victims of crime about policy and about solutions. You talked about the fact that there's this very low trust, that the justice system has, especially in communities that are sort of overrun by mass surveillance and mass incarceration. And part of that low trust is whatever's going to happen isn't going to resolve the underlying issue. So engaging with victims, whether that's through victimization surveys or through community asset mapping or through just direct dialogue with groups of victims, you can come up with new solutions to that cycle emerge. Just one example, we did a focus group with survivors of domestic violence in rural Illinois. And across the board, what the survivors of domestic violence worried about was if they were to report, the justice system would only arrest and the person would only get worse, and then the person would then be released. And so what they wanted was help for that person. Help to change behavior, violence, prevention, toxic behaviors need to be addressed and transformed. And that's what that group of survivors wanted to see, was what does real rehabilitation look like? Yes, I need this person away from me, but how are you going to change behavior? What the justice system is currently doing is not that. So, there's a wide range of solutions here, whether it's restorative justice, whether it's mental health treatment, substance use disorder treatment, trauma recovery. These are the kinds of things that engaging with survivors will result in becoming more and more popular as the solutions.
Yeah, so I think that's such an important, powerful message. I'm going to shift us kind of to a solutions conversation. And one of the questions in the chat is asking about that. So I want to give each of you a chance to kind of speak to your own vision of solutions and what you've learned in all the work you're doing with a positive program for what we can do forward. But I think starting with that theme of just engaging with victims more, and at the same time recognizing how challenging that can be, right? That there are, and this is not meant in any way, shape, or form as a criticism of your group. It's wonderful how you work so hard to get so many victims' perspectives into the work that you're doing. But I think there can be times, this has certainly been my perception, watching some things at the federal level and beyond, that there's a set of sort of usual voices. They're often very well-meaning. They're often very much reflective of their group and their constituency. But to get to that next level of voices, right, the next set of victims, maybe even people who don't realize they're victims quite the same way, that's where I think the not only the challenge lies, but it's so important to get those next vision of options as well, to start building out a really rich understanding of what those impacted by the criminal justice system and crime, really want and need. It's a lot of work, and I think that's at times why the existing criminal justice system is not well served to do that, right? The lawyers and the law enforcement officials are not trained in that kind of really social work quite the same way, and that's why it's so valuable. Not just the book to elevate these issues, but to have your group and others kind of working to get there. Aswad and Shakyra, jump in here, both in terms of the work you've done and your interactions with victims of all sorts, including your own experiences, and where that builds towards tangible policy solutions. It's really hard in these kinds of dynamic conversations to say, here are the one or two takeaways, but how about a couple takeaways that we can make sure folks who are very interested in these topics, can focus some of their attention, maybe do some advocacy work, definitely talk to, their neighbors and friends about how important elevating these issues are.
So, I'll start. You're 100%. This work is hard. When we started working, Aswad and I started working in 2016 to kind of build up like that membership base of chapters of folks who had been impacted by the justice system, right? The folks that are typically ignored. And we were able to elevate, like, where are the gaps? What are the things that folks want to change? What are the policies that we want to elevate? And this is the way that we do it. And we call it trauma-informed organizing. Because first and foremost, it's valuing that individual and their healing journey, and then assessing, okay, well, what could make things different? In Ohio, we've been able to work very effectively. We were involved in the passage of SB 66, which elevated and prioritized rehabilitation within our prison systems. TCAP expansion under House Bill 49 a few years back, which was a state budget. We worked in partnership with the State Attorney General's office under Governor DeWine and now under AG Yost to become the state with the second highest number of trauma recovery centers in the country. We recently passed Senate Bill 36, which removed barriers to victims' compensation for people with past convictions, where we saw that challenge, particularly where like parents with past convictions who lost their children to homicide, who were unable to get the resources to bury their children. That's no longer an issue because we work with our membership and with electeds to change that, as well as making sure that victims of sexual assault who had drugs in their system at the time of victimization are now able to access resources. And most recently, Senate Bill 288. We worked on specifically on elevating the expansion of transitional control, judicial control, and earned credit. We understand that it's important for us to work on both ends of the spectrum. So that's part of what we've done in Ohio. Aswad can speak more about what we've done across the country. But these voices are important. And I'll say that we've been able to work very successfully with folks on both sides of the aisle, because what we're lifting up is safety. That's not controversial. What we're lifting up is healing and support for communities. So we've been able to do that very effectively. Aswad?
Yeah, and I'll add, it really starts with listening to crime victims. If you listen to crime victims, they have really diverse experiences and perspective as well. And I think what I've learned my years of listening to survivors and sitting in their living rooms and at those local churches is that, what survivors want, most of us want what happened to us not to happen again. And also we want what happened to us not to happen to anyone else. And when you talk to survivors, we do a lot of surveying our members. We talk to thousands of survivors like daily. And for many survivors, like safety has never been about locking people up for as long as possible. Safety has always been about helping victims recover and also from preventing violence as well. And safety is really about scaling up more solutions that we're talking about. So, across the country in the state of Ohio, there are so many amazing organizations doing incredible work in communities. These are the organizations that don't have a grant writer, don't have a building, don't have transportation, but doing such amazing work of helping to provide counseling, grief counseling support, bringing survivors to appointments, helping them understand and navigating the criminal justice, helping them apply for the victim compensation program. These grassroots organizations aren't receiving the funding at the government or at the state, at the local level to meet the need in their community. So we really need to invest in more in those grassroots organizations to help build their capacity to meet this need, because we can't just rely on the justice system, to solve a lot of the issues in communities. It really starts with investing in those communities. We also, as I mentioned, really need to invest in building the infrastructure of trauma recovery centers in Ohio and across the country. When people learn about the trauma recovery center model, which is a one-stop center that provides wraparound services to crime victims, people say, why aren't these in my neighborhood? And so really investing in more in securing more funding for trauma recovery centers, and also for many survivors is providing protections. Many survivors are often having to return back to work after burying a loved one or after becoming a victim because they are in fear of losing their job. So they're going back to work while they're still grieving, still recovering from being a victim. And also many survivors are continuing to live in unsafe homes because of acts of violence happen in their community because they may be renting. They don't want to break their lease, which would cause a penalty, the economic consequences, right, of breaking your lease, but you are in fear of living in a home. So we need to provide more of those protections for survivors, but also for survivors, it's very important to listen to survivors or about the criminal justice system. Most survivors know that our criminal justice system isn't working. We also know, because that happens in our families, of many people who have paid their debts to society, who have came home, who have been home for a while, haven't committed any new crimes, but face significant barriers and legal restrictions to get housing, education, and jobs. We need to remove those barriers to help get people back to work. When you do those things, those are the things that stop the cycle of violence in communities. We really, our country really needs to invest in more of those type of safety solutions.
Wonderful, Aswad. Thank you. And I'm going to plug your book a little bit more, Lenore. But first, I'm going to plug the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center's next webinar, which we're having in a couple of weeks. It's actually focused on some of the reforms here in Ohio of SB 288, and particularly on some of the work that we're doing in the arena of record relief and record clearing. Ohio just brought in prosecutor-initiated record clearing for some offenses, and that goes to trying to break down those barriers that people experience on the back end of the criminal justice system. And so those are all sort of terrific suggestions. Now, back to your book, Lenore, your final part, a lengthy set of chapters on, I think, what you call a new safety movement. So you have, and I think it's such an important part of the work that you're doing here, not just criticizing how we got here, but really setting forth a vision of where we should be going. I'll throw in at this point what I thought was a very thoughtful question right at the outset in the Q&A from the audience, which is, are there any models in other countries that are sort of doing this better? One of the things that, again, that question got me thinking about, which is I hadn't even reflected on, and that your book now has me thinking about in this event. We're seeing, I think Pennsylvania especially is trying to pioneer, let's make our prisons look better and seem better, and that's a good thing. Let's use the Scandinavian model to make them more humane and not do all the things that you were talking about even earlier about the way in which just the construction of our prisons and the cages we confine people in are themselves traumatizing. That's great, but that's still a sort of prison-based model. That's still a, let's almost sort of a harm reduction model as opposed to actually coming up with better solutions. And my sense is your vision of a new safety movement, which I'd love to have you talk about at length, sort of builds a much more robust vision of where we ought to be headed. But, I don't know if your research or experience has led you to think that there are any other countries, that are doing this better.
Yeah, it's a great question. There are a couple of things that are important to note. First, in the era that the United States dramatically increased the number of people incarcerated, from the mid 1980s through the early 2000s, it increased 700% in the United States. That drastic increase in incarceration was not matched in other countries. So when you look at comparative nations that had similar challenges as it relates to increases in violence in the 1980s, the response was not actually to dramatically toughen up sentences or increase the number of people going in the justice system. Their crime rates also went down as ours did. So one important note in terms of how other nations are handling it is just not doing what we did to start. But then also, yes, you mentioned other nations that approach incarceration from a different perspective. There's a lot more emphasis on rehabilitation. In Germany, you have to have a PhD in rehabilitation in order to be the head of a prison in that country. That's just one example of how kind of the approach is more sort of looking at it from the perspective of the goal is behavior change, and the goal is actually corrections, and so that lifts up a different quality of candidate to oversee those types of systems. But just at the headline level here, we have to start with some basics. We have to start with giving victims an actual right to trauma recovery. It's important that we recognize that when we don't help victims recover from violence, we are setting people up to have a lifetime of consequences that cost our society dearly. Those consequences are above and beyond the cost of physical injury. We're talking about economic impacts, mental health impacts. We're talking about increases in rates of substance use disorder when victims don't get help. We're talking about the impact on children of people who've been physically harmed by violence, suffering in school, struggling, the whole family struggling to maintain housing and employment. These are interruptible harms that we could do so much more if we, as Shakyra and Aswad were describing, had a trauma recovery center on every corner, right? Real access, housing accommodations for people who've experienced trauma from violence, employment accommodations. As Shakyra described, people shouldn't be afraid to take time off work. They should be encouraged and supported in getting the kind of support and help that's needed to recover. And this trauma recovery center model, it's crisis assistance plus long-term therapeutic support. It's a model that works. It should be everywhere. But then above and beyond, new rights for victims, we need new data and new information. There's the old saying, what you measure is what you know, right? And typically in our world of criminal justice, we focus a lot on crime rates, but that's a very limited viewpoint in terms of the impact of victimization on our families and communities. Crime rates, it's a snapshot of what has come in the front door, what has been reported to the criminal justice system. But taking a step back, we know that less than half of all crime and violence is reported to the criminal justice system. And of that less than half that's reported, less than half of that is prosecuted, right? So if we really want to understand what is happening in terms of cycles of violence and victimization, we need new data. And that would come from, the victimization studies, our survivor speak convenings that we do, lifting up and engaging, requiring government to engage with survivors in a different way to tell a new story. And then, a couple of other things I throw out in terms of solutions in the book. We have this concept called scaling safety, right? Which is how many violence prevention workers does a community need? How many, domestic violence shelters, mental health treatment opportunities, crisis assistance programs? For a long time when I was in local government, we knew very well what the police department would say about how many police are needed per 100,000 residents, right? There are examples on the criminal justice side of knowing how much you need to build up that system for a neighborhood or a community. We need to really make prevention and crisis assistance essential public safety services in the same way. We need to say, this is how many trauma recovery centers Cleveland would need to be safer. This is how much, how many violence outreach workers Atlanta would need. These are things that are knowable. We can invest and build up a new infrastructure. And then just my last thought is empathy. And, there is this myth that tough justice is how you hold people accountable, and it couldn't be further from the truth. Brain science would tell us very different. What we should be doing for people who have committed harm is, yes, holding them accountable. Absolutely. We all want accountability. But if we want behavior change, we actually have to give people hope and give people an opportunity to turn their lives around. That's not going to be found in a vengeance system.
Thank you so much. And we're getting great Q&As, and I'm not going to be able to get to them all, but I wanted to sort of channel one that I noticed that was talking about, and I think it's a great example of kind of the way in which there's a kind of a hierarchy of harm, and this gets leveraged into punitiveness, and that relates to drug-induced homicide charges, right? When people die of overdoses, and then it's become a priority in some communities to treat every one of those cases as a homicide, even though there may be instances in which it's, literally family members that have provided the drugs, and it's a product of substance abuse problems that run, through a family, through a community, and nobody associated with the overdose wants the person prosecuted that way. They understand. We've seen some of these victims speak up in opposition to efforts to treat, a lot of these cases as homicides or to punish them severely, but they become leveraged as a basis for more punitive approaches to the drug war. And again, it's where it's just a failure to listen to all the voices that are out there. There's a diverse set of perspectives, not just on drug policy specifically, generally, but on how to respond to these kinds of overdose deaths. And yet we only hear one set of voices. We don't see that as consistently. And Aswad, this is a very unfair question to direct specifically to you, so I want you to be able to talk to some of these solutions more generally. But I was especially intrigued that one of the comments in the Q&A brought up a topic that I think, again, reflecting kind of the criminal justice reform and the sentencing reform community especially, is of great interest, which is second look sentencing, or efforts to give persons who get long terms of incarceration kind of a chance to go back and re-argue for a shorter sentence at some point in their term. And just last month, there were hearings at the U.S. Sentencing Commission to revise the rules about how that might work in the federal level. And sure enough, there were victims groups there that were very vocal in saying, let's not allow second look sentencing for victims of violent, for offenders who committed violent crimes, because you just necessarily re-victimize the victims if there's this hearing where somebody's saying they should get a shorter sentence. And your comments, Lenore, highlighted to me, well, they're still suffering trauma that is about the trauma they experience writ large, not about how long this person is spending in prison, but now it's been channeled kind of into this conversation about should the person possibly get a get a second look at his or her sentence. And so, again, unfair to bring it to you because I know you direct victim, and you even spoke about the experience you had learning about the offender, who I think you said is still incarcerated. But whether you or anybody else has sort of a perspective on how we elevate voices effectively in that conversation, not just about initial sentencing, but about possible resentencing, or even, some of these back end issues you mentioned as well, Aswad. I can imagine somebody, oh, I don't want that person to get a job, cutting hair, driving a car when they, hit me, with their car, is that putativeness just a kind of knee-jerk aspect of our adversarial system that's going to always have prosecutors bringing forward victims to try to argue against this? Or is part of the solution here is making sure victims understand they can be part of the reconsideration in a healthy way, not in a traumatizing way?
Yeah, no, it's not an unfair question. I think why we are here with mass incarceration or, long prison sentences, because we've always listened to a narrow voice of victims, and many victims have different healing journeys. From our work, we've surveyed a lot of victims, and we just released our newest publication a few months ago, which is a national survey of crime victims' views on safety and justice. We released it in 2016. We just released another updated version in 2022. And what we found out back in 2016, what we know in our work from talking to victims every day, what we found out in our newest report is that, victims, once again, prefer shorter prison sentences rather than long-term prisons as well. And we also found that 3 out of 4 crime victims, want sentence reductions for people who participate in rehabilitation and follow those prison rules, which, help require people to complete, which help, complete their full length sentences. So it's like more rehabilitation rather than long prisons, and also giving people an opportunity to have a second chance or a second look at returning home or from prison. We know that, the longer people stay in prison, they cycle out of crime as well. So it's not always a threat to public safety. So in our report talking about crime victims, you have to listen to a broad perspective of crime victims. And when you do that, you'll hear from victims that, it's not just being tough on crime, it's not just long in prison, it's actually being shorter and smarter, right? So it's more rehabilitation. Also victims, 3 to 1 prefer holding people accountable beyond just prison, right? So looking at opportunities for diversion, rehabilitation is the primary thing that victims are advocate as it relates to the criminal justice reform. So we just need to continue to listen to a broad perspective of crime victims and continue to lift up the people that are most harmed by violence, that are most harmed by the criminal justice system. When people are coming out of prison, majority of them are coming back to our communities, and we want to make sure that folks are rehabilitated, but also that they are coming home, be able to get housing and jobs as well. And Lenore, Shakyra, anything you want to add?
I'll jump in, just say, sadly, we're kind of close to running out of time, so we're going to kind of do closing thoughts, although reacting to everything that's come up to this point. And Shakyra, we'll start with you, and feel free to not just touch on what we've just talked about, but expand that a little bit as we wrap up.
Just real quickly, we can have a much healthier country, a safer country, if we assess data properly, invest it properly to ensure that our metrics are the goal. The goal is safety, not incarceration, not disregard, not neglecting crime victims and the needs of communities. We need to invest in safety, and that means doing things drastically differently than what we are doing now. Thank you.
Thank you. And Lenore, I'll give you the sort of final word, though you can take some time because we've got a few minutes for that. I'm pleased to see in the Q&A people asking about the book. I think we've tried to get that in the chat so that we do exactly what this was designed to do, which is whet people's appetite, because there's so much in what you've written that can't be covered in the little time that we have. But you want to sort of give some closing vision of this, and also perhaps also speak to what individuals in their community can do other than buy the book and listen to these kinds of programs, but some tangible actions people can do in the short term as well as the long term.
Well, thank you so much for having us in this discussion today. Just building off of what Aswad was describing and a number of the comments in the chat, victims absolutely deserve a voice in the justice process. I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, how are we defining justice? There is a real difficult path that we've paved for ourselves in the criminal justice system by defining justice for victims as the maximum punishment, as the maximum, sort of toughness that imprisonment can offer. When we instead look at justice stopping the cycle. If we flip and say, instead of sort of vengeance is how we're going to describe this, we're going to say that we are getting closer toward justice when we actually are able to stop the cycle of trauma and stop the cycle of violence. That opens up a very different set of conversations. I think that people who work in the justice system can engage survivors in a conversation about what it would take to stop this from ever happening again. What does that look like? Our justice system is not trauma informed. The prosecutor who's calling the victim 20 years after a horrific crime has happened, a cold call, out of the blue, with no forewarning, sort of saying, you gotta react because the person might be up for parole. That's sort of a re-traumatizing experience for victims is not how we should understand justice. We need to start from the very beginning, after a harm happens, first and foremost, providing a pathway for people to heal. And then secondly, in the process of that healing, opening up a dialogue about what it would look like to stop this from ever happening again. That's going to give us a range of options beyond prison. It's going to give us an opportunity to think differently about this and also invest differently when it comes to safety. So real wonderful opportunity to have this conversation. If people are interested, alliancefoursafetyandjustice.org is our website. We're doing Survivor Speak events all across the country. You can go to alliancefoursafetyandjustice.org and click through to survivorsspeak.org. If you have direct experience and want to get involved in our organization, we welcome you to do that. We can also refer you if you're interested in other organizations doing aligned work. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for, bringing all this richness to our conversation. That's where I'll sort of provide the closing thoughts, both vis-a-vis the work of our center and the victim's perspective in particular. There's just so much here, right? And that's where I sometimes think the biggest problem with our criminal justice system is it wants easy answers, right? It wants kind of a simplistic, hey, if we pass another statute, if we can point to enforcing, these many laws, these ways, or have these many people in prison, we're doing better. And that's not it. And your call for data, especially because I think there's so little we actually know about what victims want, what's really important to them, and the way in which the criminal justice system helps or hurts them. And so I'm just so grateful that you brought these messages through your book and through this conversation. And I hope it's one that we'll continue to have. And that's one that also I extend to the community of folks who signed in, and hope that you'll reach out both to our center and to obviously your alliance to keep doing this critically important work. It is really hard, and that's partially why it's so important that as many people understand that as they get in and confront the challenge of making our justice system all it can be. And so with that, I end us a couple minutes early so everybody can get a drink and get on with their day. Thank you all for again spending the time, and so grateful to the participants. Join me in thanking them and continuing the needed conversation about these tough topics. Thank you so much. Be well, everybody, and take care. And we look forward to seeing you on the next events.